Sir Keir Starmer, Your Majesty.
Your Majesty.
You must be utterly exhausted and nearly on your knees. But not much. Quite a grueling. Yes. Anyway, you're here.
Yes. It's a very sort of quick changeover.
I know, to say the least. And having to get to grips with everything straight away must be quite exhausting.
The recent actions of Keir Starmer, leader of the Labour Party, have come as a real political shock to Britain. His decision to propose reforms aimed at limiting the privileges of the monarchy has caused a real shock among the British people. Suddenly, the question that seemed so distant became an urgent one for millions. Was it possible for the British monarchy to lose some of its traditional powers? This decision, according to Starmer, was supposed to be a step towards modernization, but instead it caused massive protests and division among politicians and ordinary citizens alike. The outrage was so strong that even King Charles III was forced to intervene in what was happening, showing rare activity in the political life of the country. Under the pressure of this crisis, which was unparalleled in recent decades, the government was on the verge of a constitutional conflict. The King's intervention was a clear signal that the government had crossed an invisible line that touched the very essence of the British political system. This moment was a turning point, not only for Starmer, but for the entire Labour Party, facing the consequences of its ambitious but highly controversial decisions.
Prime Minister, thanks for joining us on Sky News today. During the general election, you campaigned on a message of change, of doing politics differently and making yours a government of service. And yet you find yourself caught in a row over the huge amount of freebies you've accepted while leader of the opposition, £107,000, far more than any other MP.
Keir Starmer's proposal to limit the privileges of the monarchy immediately sparked a storm of protest, not only among supporters of the royal family, but also among the wider society. Starmer, who decided to take this step in the hope of modernizing Britain, has been the target of harsh criticism for jeopardizing the traditions on which the country has stood for centuries. His actions are seen by many as nothing more than attacks on essential elements of British identity. For traditional monarchists, it was a direct challenge, and for supporters of the Labour Party, it was a political mistake that only reinforced the sense that old values and traditions had been forgotten. King Charles III himself, who had always tried to avoid direct intervention in politics, now found himself in a difficult situation. His discontent became obvious. Against the backdrop of such initiatives, the monarchy risked losing influence in the affairs of state. Political observers quickly realized that this was not just another political move, but the beginning of a serious struggle for the future of Great Britain, which could lead to changes affecting the foundations of the constitutional structure of the country.
Do you acknowledge that this has undermined your message and reputation, and are you sorry about that?
Well, I think it's important just to put it in its context. Any gift or donation to a politician has to be declared. Everything I've had has been declared. And sitting behind the numbers are some human explanations. So quite a lot of that money was for tickets for football matches. I pay for my own tickets at Arsenal. I've got season tickets. Unfortunately, I can't sit in the stand anymore for security reasons. And the club have said, well, in which case, be our guest in the director's box if and when there's space. Now, no money changes hands. You can't buy a ticket. But then the register says, well, what's the amount that would be the equivalent even though you didn't buy the ticket? And that has to be declared.
Yes.
Now, that means if I didn't do that, I couldn't go to Arsenal. I go with my boy. Second example I'll just give you is some of that money was for the loan of a flat during the election period. No money changed hands.
Yes, and that was related to your son.
Yeah, there was no cash adjustment. We had a situation where the election was called, not when we expected it, I think most people. My son happened to be in the middle of his GCSE.
When King Charles III, who traditionally avoided interfering in political affairs, found himself at the center of this confrontation, it was a clear sign that the situation was out of control. The monarch, who had always tried to stay out of the political fray, now faced a direct threat to his institutional status. Inside sources from Buckingham Palace say that the king was extremely concerned about moves by the Labour government that questioned the integrity of the British monarchy and the traditional order. At first, the monarch may have tried to distance himself from the conflict, but it quickly became apparent that he could not do without his involvement. His intervention in private conversations with political leaders both within the Labour Party and in the opposition underscored the magnitude of the crisis. Charles III clearly felt that remaining neutral in such a situation would not work, as the government's actions jeopardized not only the institution of the monarchy, but also the social unity of the country. His concern about possible future political instability was so obvious that it became clear that the situation required a solution. This intervention, although not public, was a meaningful step to protect British tradition. The rise in support for Reform UK amidst the political crisis caused by Keir Starmer's actions was one of the most striking and unexpected aspects of the conflict. A party previously perceived as marginal has now suddenly found itself at the centre of the British political scene, acting as the main alternative to a weakened Labour government. Nigel Farage, the leader of Reform UK, has masterfully seized the moment, turning public discontent into a political advantage. His speeches, full of vivid and pointed criticisms of Starmer and his government, attracted the attention of disillusioned voters. Support for the party increased rapidly, especially among those who were dissatisfied with Labour's economic policies and its actions towards the monarchy. Reform UK managed to capture a huge section of the electorate that had previously felt ignored by the traditional parties. Farage presented himself and his party as defenders of British tradition and those willing to fight for stability in the country, unlike Labour, which, in his view, only contributed to its division. His strategy proved highly successful, and Reform UK quickly evolved from a small protest force to a serious political threat, poised to become a key player in the future British political landscape.
That means there are a lot of journalists outside the front door and in the street. I'm not complaining about that, but if you're 13, as my girl is, if you're 16, as my boy is, that's quite hard to navigate when you're concentrating on GCSEs. Now, hear me out, because you put it to me.
Yeah.
So I said, we're going to get you out of here and get you somewhere where you can just study and get to school and back without having to go through all of that. And that's when someone said, well, in which case I can make this flat available to you. It's safe, secure, he can get on with the job. No money exchanged hands, no money exchanged hands, but for the registrar, no, but you've put it to me, let me just finish. For the registrar's purposes, he says, well, I know you didn't pay and nobody gave you money, but let's work out what it would have been worth if it had been a commercial transaction, which it wasn't. So I'm not saying, of course I understand why you ask questions, etc. But I do think sometimes it's important just to sort of look behind the number and say...
The political situation within the Labour Party was rapidly deteriorating and the internal divide was becoming increasingly apparent. After public conflict with the monarchy and disastrous mistakes in economic policy, Starmer found himself at the centre of intense criticism, not only in the opposition, but also from within his own party. A growing number of party members began to openly question his leadership skills and ability to deal with the crisis. At first, these were only quiet complaints at party meetings, but they soon escalated into open demands for his resignation. Talk began to emerge among senior party figures about possible candidates to replace Starmer. In the face of mounting pressure, even his closest allies began to realize that the party could collapse if he remained in power. The difficulties of governing and the lack of clear policies meant that Labour's electorate, previously staunchly supportive of the party, began to become massively disillusioned. The working class, which had once been Labour's mainstay, now increasingly rejected it, believing that the party had lost touch with the people. Internal unrest was increasing and many in the party began to look for ways to distance themselves from Starmer, seeing his departure as the only way to preserve their chances of political survival. The future of British politics after the crisis caused by Keir Starmer's actions was not so certain. The Reform UK party, led by Nigel Farage, was rapidly gaining support and increasingly became the main alternative to Labour. Britain's traditional two-party system, seemingly unshakable, was now on the verge of collapse. The fall of Labour under the blows of internal division and public discontent was the catalyst for a political revolution, and Reform UK took a place that had once seemed impossible for such a young party. The growth of its popularity was no accident. Farage, skillfully exploiting political instability, became a symbol of change, promising to return to the basics of British tradition and restore the stability he saw as a lost legacy. It is important to note, however, that support for Reform UK was not limited to right-wing and conservative voters. The masses of people disillusioned with Labour and unable to believe in the changes proposed by the Conservative Party looked to Reform UK as a real alternative. The emergence of this party on the political scene had changed the landscape, and the future of Britain now depended on whether Reform UK could sustain its wave of popularity and make a real claim to power.